All right, so today we got Lenny Parracino. So, uh, I know he's currently work for the LA Clippers as a soft tissue therapist, and you're also an instructor in Gray Institute. Can you like introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure to share. Well, it's been a long journey. I've been doing this quite a long time. Still feel like a beginner, which is a good thing. I think I'm 32 years into practice, maybe 33. You get to a certain point and you're like, wow, I've been doing this for a while. And it's been a long journey. I started off in strength and conditioning, and I had a really good mentor early on who's a physical therapist, and he encouraged me because he saw my love for anatomy to get into more of the hands-on approach. I guess you could look at it as more of a local approach to the global approach we were taking on the floor from a strength conditioning and even into sport-specific type drilling. And instead of going through the rigors of another full program, such as physical therapy or even athletic training, the organization I worked for at the time, the National Academy of Sports Medicine, allowed me to go to massage therapy school. But what was interesting about that, my instructors were rolfers and chiropractors. And so the curriculum was very different. And I ended up gaining some mentors from that program and taking other pieces of curriculum along the way when I was a lot younger. And it's been a journey ever since. So I still have a private practice that deals with a very diversified clientele. So young people, old people, people that are really active, some people just activities of daily living. And then I also work for the Los Angeles Clippers as a soft tissue therapist. And that allows me to work with some of the more superior athletes in their field. But in private practice at the Meyer Institute of Sport in Los Angeles, we see the hockey players, baseball players, volleyball players, NBA players from different teams. So that private practice, again, is very diversified.
Nice, nice. I kind of regret it. I didn't press recording earlier because I
Oh,
thought that conversation was like really awesome. But so allow me to ask this again. So you said you're a soft tissue therapist. So what exactly is the difference between soft tissue therapist and athletic trainer or PT?
yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I think I would answer it by exploring what a model is. There's a famous quote that really rang true to me a long time ago by George Box, who was a famous statistician. And he said, all models are approximations. Essentially, all models are wrong, but some are useful. However, the approximate nature of the model must always be borne in mind. Now, over the years, I've modified that, and I wouldn't say that all models are wrong. I would say they're incomplete. They're incomplete in the sense that when we go to school for physical therapy, we go to school for athletic training, we go to school for strength and conditioning. It's a model. It's the way we as humans model complex scenarios, or if you look at it, complex systems. Complex systems are very different than complicated systems. And this is where we get into a little bit of trouble, is when we have rules and protocols that allow us to figure out complicated systems or complicated things, and we use those rules and protocols on complex systems, which are very chaotic and have high levels of variability. And that's kind of what George was saying is your model may work some of the time, but not all of the time. So when you ask me the question, like, how did you come up with this? soft tissue therapy niche. It was what I saw. I want you to really think about this. If you're working with people in a gym setting, strength conditioning, um, and these people have a goal of being healthier, want to move faster, be more explosive, want to be more flexible, all these different biomotor abilities, these different biobehaviors. Is that really the model of pathology? Or is that the model of function or dysfunction? And it dawned on me that the model, if I went into physical therapy, I'd be very good at the pathology side, but I might not be really good at the population I wanted to work with. And so people say, what is soft tissue therapy? Well, it's a system that I developed, soft tissue management, for a problem that I witnessed. And I've been doing it ever since. And it works beautifully with physical therapy, with athletic training, with strength and conditioning. In fact, at the Meyer Institute of Sport, I mean, it's seamless. We all play off of one another. So I don't agree with George Bach saying all models are wrong. I say they're all incomplete because complex systems are very chaotic. And so what you specialize in can really complement what other people specialize in. And so, long way of saying it's something that I've created. We teach this course, and I started off with a bunch of questions, and it comes from this quote, never get married to your answers. Instead, always marry yourself to the questions. And what that means is this approach encourages a mindset of continuous inquiry and openness to new ideas rather than becoming fixed on specific answers. It emphasizes the importance of curiosity and the pursuit of understanding over the comfort of certainty. And so I always say, never get married to your answers. Instead, always marry yourself to the questions. So the questions, and this is an ongoing course curriculum, it's kind of my passion and my study, is what is soft tissue health? And that gets fun because if you define what soft tissue is, that brings us into a whole nother conversation. And then is there a universal definition of it? And what you're going to find is there's not. Depends on who you study, depends on where you are in the world. And then once we can agree on what soft tissue health is, then what is soft tissue dysfunction? And then how does dysfunction differ from pathology? So those are the ongoing questions that I've had over the years and I constantly explore. Now, from an application perspective, and I think these questions are really important for anyone working with clients, is how do we manage soft tissue health? Once we define it, then the question is, well, how do you manage it? How about this one? Dr. Gary Gray and Dr. David Tiberios, who I love the Gray Institute, they were wonderful at this. They said, let's have Y Day. You know what Y Day is? Eric, think about it. Next time you work with a client, ask yourself, why are you doing what you're doing? And can you explain why you are doing what you're doing using unifying principles? Not just because you learned it in school. Like we need to question things. So the question I have is what technique to use and when? If you ever see me on my Instagram page, I always put a little hashtag press and pray. Or I think I put don't press and pray. Do you know how many times someone's touching the body and they're saying that they're touching X, Y, and Z? And it's just simply memorization out of a textbook?
Yeah.
Like my first fresh tissue dissection, which is very different than in a university setting where you have treated tissue. So this is untreated tissue. If you go in the lab on a Monday, they may have been alive on Friday. They're movable, even though they're a little cooler. They're movable bodies. And someone handed me a scalpel and said, go find the lateral collateral ligament of the knee. or the medial collateral ligament of the knee. And what you'll find is it's very difficult, if not impossible, unless you first memorize it from a textbook and then guess where it is. But if I said to you, hey, go find the ACL, pretty much anyone in the lab can find it. And that's because it just so happens to be one of the two ligaments in the human body that are all by themselves. Whereas the other ones are classified as ligaments, but they're really densities within a matrix. So again, we got to be careful memorizing stuff out of a textbook and making the assumption, a senseless sometimes assumption, that that's what we're palpating. And that's where we get into the other question, what are we able to palpate and how? Like, what can we really palpate? What techniques to use and when? What are we able to palpate and how? How do manual techniques work based on the evidence that's out there today? What does the data suggest? Who are the experts around the world that are looking at this? Like the gold standard in soft tissue health analysis is shear wave elastography. Very few people, very few people are skilled in it, and very few people use it. It's expensive, so I don't see it being super popular in the future, but it is the gold standard, and it's allowing us to understand more and more about soft tissue health, dysfunction, pathology, the differences between the two. And then what changes can we expect? This is a big one. This is a big question. If I said to you, hey, Eric, I'm going to rub on your bicep and it's going to grow, would your bullshit meter go off? Of course it would. Because muscle hypertrophy doesn't happen that way. Then why do we think we can break down fibrotic adhesions, which arguably is a stronger tissue than a muscle fiber? Muscle fibers heal very, very fast. They're highly vasculated. You can lose muscle very quickly in a bedridden state. So it's a highly adaptive tissue. Think about when you burn your tongue when you drink something hot. How long does it last? Maybe 24 hours? Well, the tongue is like eight muscles. It's highly vasculated tissue. So if I can't rub on you and create hypertrophy, how am I supposed to break down white connective tissue in the body? You're not. So in our questioning, in our classes, what we do is we go through the science of this so that when we do palpate, we're not making erroneous assumptions as to what we're palpating. And we give people what we believe to be the most accurate evidence as we know it today. But don't get married to those answers. It's more about marrying the questions and constantly exploring with humility and adaptability.
Nice, nice. I love it. I love it. So I guess that leads me to the next question. Like you like in the course, or you use soft tissue a lot, but like why not like fascia or like other like whatever term people use, but like just soft tissue?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think the best way to answer your question is to ask the group, like, well, what is soft tissue? Well, if we define it and we go to Google, I mean, I'm so old, I used to go to a library. So, so you go to a library and you pick up a book on what is soft tissue. The definition is it's any tissue in the body that's not bone. Any tissue in the body that's not bone. So in reality, it's a multi-scale continuous body network. This is the problem. So Eric, let me ask you a question. Don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's a kind of a fun question I always ask people. How many oceans are there?
Five?
Well, in recent schooling, I think they would say seven, but I would say that would be incorrect, five or seven. That's what you memorized. If you ask a child before they get to school and they say, well, how do I figure it out? And you say, well, go to the globe, they'll come back and tell you there's one because there is no separation. This is our problem with anatomy. You're always touching fascia, you're always touching nerve, you're always touching skin, it's all a continuous matrix of tissue. And that is why when I say soft tissue, whether you're strength conditioning or athletic training, again, you got to be careful with these models that have singled everything out. When the reality is it's a continuous body-wide network. And that's starting to be much more understood. For years, they've talked about separating definitions into anatomical and functional. And this is why. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, you really need to know geographic anatomy because you have to navigate around structures and you don't want to damage structures through these invasive techniques. But as soon as that body stands up and starts moving, it's a different analysis. It's a continuum of tissue. Another example I give people is what part of the pants did you put on today? The whole pant. What part of the watch tells time? The whole watch. Then my other analogy is if every day you were studying telephone poles and one day I came up to you and said, Eric, what are you doing? And you say, well, I'm really trying to understand forestry. And I'd say, whew, that's interesting. Have you ever thought about going into the forest? It's not that you can't glean some information from that telephone pole, but how much of the forest will you understand? So we have to be careful studying the textbooks of our anatomy to understand living, dynamic, ever-changing tissue. This is a problem in research, a very big problem in research, because we're dealing with living organisms and living anatomy. And in our course, we talk in depth about this because it has everything to do with our strategies that we have to put forth to help people function. There's a new paper written in the Journal of Anatomy, and I don't mind you giving out my information. I'll get people past the paywall because it's like a $50 paper, but it's titled Towards a Comprehensive Definition of the Human Fascial System. And you'll oftentimes hear people in the world of evidence say, well, you can't stretch fascia. You can't stretch the IT band. It's not that they're incorrect, they're correct. But where the myopic thinking is fascia is not a tissue, it's a system made up of many different anatomical structures. So the more accurate way of saying you can't stretch fascia is to say you can't stretch, nor would you want to, dense fascia or dense connective tissue. It changes shape. That's how we load to unload. That's how we go through different, what we call transformation zones. But it doesn't actually stretch unless it's injured. You follow? But loose connective tissue changes all the time. You ever notice that? And you get up in the morning, your back is a little stiff, and
Yeah.
then you get moving around, maybe take a hot shower, and you're like, oh, it's not stiff anymore. Well, what do you think that is? That your loose connective tissue, from a nomenclature perspective, changing behaviors. It happens all the time. I just flew on a plane from Miami to Atlanta. I'm on a road trip with the team, and I can feel my legs are a little heavy because I was on a plane. Because the contractile units, which help to pump these different connective tissue elements, obviously was not working on an airplane. So we end up with a little increased fluid pressure, and the legs get a little heavy, interestingly. And so, yeah, our definitions are super important. And, the way we navigate all this is we follow what we call first principles relative to the context of soft tissue. And I have six that I use. I don't know if we have the time to get into them, but this allows me to answer the questions that you have for me, answer questions that clients have for me. And then when we explore this subject matter, how to navigate through a complex organism. And that's how you do it, is you don't really have rules and protocols. It's more about here are your principles that help to guide you. And that's what I always loved about the Gray Institute. They taught principles and that allowed people to become a better practitioner of themselves. In other words, you didn't have to follow the way Gary did it or Dave did it or Lenny. These are the principles. Now you do the art. Here are your three basic colors to all art. And everyone's art is different, but it all comes from the three basic colors. So that's the whole idea of first principles.
All right. I'm gonna do this. I'm not, probably not gonna follow the list I sent it to. Can we kind of like maybe go to the principle you just mentioned? Like, what are those six principles you followed?
Yeah, it's been a long journey for me because you want to try to simplify things and come up with what you believe to be your strong first principles that guide you in your career. So this isn't something I just whipped up, in 5 years. This took some time. And I think because of a puzzle I kept encountering, and here's the puzzle that there were a couple biologists that stated this, the puzzle between structure and function. And the saying goes, structure without function. So think of it like whatever name you want of your structure without function, the things that you do, is a corpse. So structure without function is a corpse. We kind of learn it that way in our textbooks. Go to the cadaver lab. Even a fresh cadaver lab is like, wow, different than a treated cadaver lab, but it's still not a living human. And so structure without function is a corpse, and function without structure is a ghost. I'm going to say that this is the structural puzzle. How many times have you heard somebody say, well, I have back pain, I went and got an MRI and I had a disc herniation, to later find that their back pain goes away, they function at a very high level, and herniation meant nothing? I mean, there's countless studies. I have them all on my computer saved for people to help people not get paralysis by analysis. And because in the NBA, we will do MRIs as part of a physical, if you didn't know that it was an athlete and you didn't know their age, you would think that these people were in an old folks' home. When you start to look at the degenerative changes of feet, degenerative changes of knees, and other parts of the body, but they function at a very, very high level, very high level. So the next aha moment I had in my career, so I always love sharing this, especially with new practitioners, but it's great for all levels, is this. When I got into working with some of the most elite athletes, some that I watched on TV and I was nervous to see in the clinic, I'm like, whoa. I remember earlier in my career, I would see these people and I thought they were going to be perfect. And little did I realize, like, wow, I'm old enough to be their dad, and my structure is way healthier than their structure in some cases. But I could never do what they do. I could dream about doing what they do. I could never do it. And it really confused me until I met some really smart people in the space world because our clinic is next to SpaceX and my other clinic is next to the Jet Propulsion Labs. And so I got to be friends and I consider them mentors of one, a physicist that works in space science, and another is a PhD in engineering. And it's kind of interesting because those are two different models and they don't always agree. You ever hear that? Like, oh, math always tells you everything. Well, no. If so, then we wouldn't have rockets blowing up.
Yeah.
So it's really fascinating. That again goes back to the complex versus, complicated, right? With ingenuity and time, complicated things can be reproduced and we can figure it out. Like think of how complicated your phone is. Well, there's other companies that make phones now because we can copy things, but complex is totally different. So it's kind of fascinating. And you know what they both said to me? They said you have to study systems thinking. Go on Amazon and just buy systems thinking book. You don't have to read the whole thing, but you have to understand how systems work because this is the aha moment I had. One can exhibit global function. Okay, LeBron James can do what LeBron James can do. Steph Curry does what Steph Curry, Kelly Slater does what Kelly Slater does. Freaky athletes. Yet they can lack local tissue capacity. And I didn't really understand this until I understood systems thinking. Here's why. As the system's capacities rise, so do the contributions. So as a system's demands rise, so do the contributions of the system. It can make up for a zone of weakness. Here's a great example. Ever see someone in a gym who can squat the house and they reach over to pick something up and their back goes out? So
Yeah.
it's not all about strength, is it?
Hmm.
Even though strength is a great bio behavior to have, it's not all about strength. It's way more complex than that. So system capacity is different than tissue capacity. And then I started to really ponder this. Hmm, if I improve tissue capacities, it can provide me with the basis for longevity to do the thing we call function. Doesn't guarantee you're going to function at a high level. You still have to do that. So that's where the modeling is always incomplete, and it behooves us, all of us, to cross domains to add to the model that is our bias, the thing that we've studied. So again, how this complex system is navigated are through these principles. So I'll rattle them off and then whatever questions you have with them, because obviously they're kind of chapters in themselves. But number one, tissues evolve throughout life as a continuous matrix. And in our classes, we prove this a lot of different ways. There's been some reverse dissections. There's been endoscopic video footage of living anatomy. So it is someone that's on a table under anesthesia. Obviously, they went in for surgery and they actually put a camera inside their body and they blew or magnified that footage up to understand what it looks like inside the living body. Although they're not moving around, it still gives us a much different lens than what we've been used to. The next important part of structure is the living body is mainly fluid. Do you realize when you're born, you're in the 90 percentile fluid, and if you make it to age 80, by then you're around the 50 percentile? So now you understand what wrinkles are, what degenerative processes are. Now, Patricia Hudson wrote a paper, I think it was in 2022. It's very interesting. And she came out and showed all this modeling that every degenerative process ends up in fibrosis, which is basically think about it as dehydrated tissue that's unorganized. Every single one, regardless of the name, and realize that we die mainly of degenerative processes. Heart disease is a degenerative process. You don't wake up with heart disease. It starts very early on and just takes years and years to develop. That's why it always fascinates me when people think they like woke up with these things. Like I woke up with knee pain. I mean, sometimes you can, but a lot of times these are degenerative processes over time. And if you're not working on these tissue capacities, it seems like you wake up with them. Okay, so the third one with respect to structure. So I have kind of three that fit structure and three that fit function. Humans exhibit a body-wide tensional network. There's always tension in the body, always. Not just contractile tension, non-contractile tension. And so those three tissues evolve throughout life as a continuous matrix. The living body is mainly fluid. And then the third one is humans exhibit a body-wide tensional network. So to me, those are the three first principles that navigate structure. So when I'm reading a paper, taking a class, reading a book, these are in my brain as a way to filter through how much of I am I reading is useful versus useless information. Okay, now when it comes to function, movement is a signal of life. You agree with that? I mean, show me one thing in the living world that if it stops moving, it doesn't degenerate, decay, and die. Everything, water, you name it. Like we need movement for survival. So movement is a signal of life. So this whole idea of immobilizing things, the good physicians now are understanding this more than anything. They're encouraging movement right away. So the second one, and this is a neurologic principle, it's right out of your basic textbooks. Sensory input drives motor output. Now, here's a really fun question. This perplexed me for a while. How do we humans learn to move? So I asked myself this question one day, and I was like, whoa, I don't have a clue as to how we learn to move. So I started asking a bunch of people, and I got all different answers. Like, oh, I watch my parents, I learn from my parents. I'm like, well, but blind people learn to move. So that can't be the answer. And so it's really fascinating. Remember how we learned our five senses early on in school? What is the one sense you can't live without? And there's only two medically documented cases in the world where these just so happen to be gentlemen. They actually survived this. But it's a really interesting case.
No, no.
Your sense of touch. So if you watch how we as humans learn to move, we learn to move through pressure and tension that we sense. Remember, sensory input drives motor output. Do you realize how important hands-on palpation is now? As soon as someone touches you, that input is being driven through the system. That's how you know where you are right now. And so for those that want to kind of dig deep into it, you probably can go on YouTube and watch the documentary, The Man Who Lost His Body, Ian Waterman. It's a very rare case of losing proprioception. This is not paralyzed. This is losing your sensory, not your motor. He had full motor function, but he lost his sensory. So sensory input drives motor output. And then the last one is loading is essential. Regardless of what you decide to do in manual therapy, you have to load the system, and that has to be relative to what you're trying to accomplish. So, from a functional perspective, movement is a signal of life, sensory input drives motor output, and loading is essential. So, those are the six first principles, basic fundamental assumptions that can't be deduced any further that allow me to navigate through, whether it be practically one on one or in a group or even when I'm reading on my own.
Nice, nice. Man, that was fascinating. That was like really fascinating.
Well, I hope it's useful. I think it's very important.
Yeah, it is. Definitely is.
Not that anyone has to follow these six, but I always encourage people like to sit down with yourself in your notebook and like, what first principles am I using to write a program? You know, we're all smart enough to do it individually. And that's what I always loved about Dr. Gary Gray and Dr. David Tiberio at the Gray Institute. They never tried to make you like them. They exposed us to these different principles like, hey, gravity exists. We can't see it, but we know it's there. And then there's ground reaction force, and then your mass, and then your momentum. And how does this all relate to movement? Well, it's it's very much a part of movement. And so, yeah, it allows us to be that creative, humble facilitator and not
Nice,
something that just memorizing, what was taught in school.
nice, nice. This is awesome. This is really awesome. So, uh, that leads me to like I guess that you already answered that already, but I'm still gonna ask it anyway. And we kind of talk about this on the phone is like when like as a strength coach, I like my thoughts on improving performance is like making them like bigger, stronger, faster, or like increase their like acceleration mechanics, deceleration mechanics, whatsoever.
Hmm.
But like you mentioned on the phone, like your thoughts on these biomotor like qualities are different. And I, correct me if I'm wrong, but like I remember like you're saying like it depends on the person's soft tissue health. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's something over the years I've evolved into, with the model that I use is okay, everybody wants to function. And then there's these different bio behaviors. I think in some of the textbooks, they call them biomotor abilities. And the ones that are very common are power, agility, strength, speed, coordination, balance, endurance, and flexibility. And I know Dr. Andy Galpin, I like his work. He's got like 12 different ones, I think, or maybe even more. But those are the kind of the eight that people talk about. And so, okay, well, I always challenge like, what is strength? Well, strength is really your ability to produce an internal tension against an external environment. And then there's all these subcategories of strength, right? But all of these things have something in common. They only go as far as your health. So, interestingly, you can be an unhealthy person and go to the gym and get stronger to later find out you're going to hit a plateau real fast relative to the healthy person. And then you might end up in a downward spiral. You ever do that? You're kind of under the weather. You go, no, mentally, because it's good for my psyche. I'm going to go to the gym, you work out, and then you get really sick. Happens a lot because your system's going to figure it out. It's going to figure it out. So then that led me to, okay, what is soft tissue health? And then what are the various interrelated considerations of soft tissue health? Thus far in 2025, this is what I've come up with. Genetics. But always remember something about genetics. Genetics is like a loaded gun. It's your environment that pulls the trigger. Always remember that. And that's the world of epigenetics, where identical twins are separated at birth and they live two totally different lifestyles and you have totally different outcomes. So you're not held captive to your genetics. You might have to work a little harder than the next person, and that's environment. So again, genetics load the gun, but the environment pulls the trigger. Then there's age, and I look at age two different ways. Yes, your chronological age, like I'm not a spring chicken anymore, so I have to respect that. But then also your training age. Some people call it your biological age, like where are you health-wise? Because again, if I have a blindfold on and I'm to palpate a foot and ankle complex and say you lined up five people in a supine position, so they're lying on their back on a table and I'm blindfolded, I could not tell the difference between an NBA player's foot at maybe 25 to 30 years of age and a 70-year-old's foot because of the amount of wear and tear. And this is what I do for people all the time that get too paralyzed by their structural changes. I go, please Google, it's local knowledge, LeBron James's foot on vacation. Because they have someone took a picture of him and they have a very scaled in version of his foot. It's mangled. And I'm going to argue that he is one of the most robust athletes we've ever seen, given the stress that he's been through and for how long. Now, the average fan may not realize this. I know you do. But when you're in the playoffs and you've been in the playoffs as long as he has, all the way to the end, that's like a whole nother season. That is another NBA season because of the intensity level. And so there's age chronologically, but then there's also training age. And so there's genetic age, and then there's history. And everybody agrees with this. Because we're vertebrates, we don't replicate exact duplicates, we remodel as humans. This is not a car, it is not a building. And this is a big problem, Eric, with respect to using engineering physics or Newtonian physics on the human body. What happens when you load a building over time? Or let me ask it this way. Could a structural engineer figure out how much load it's going to take to collapse a roof? The answer is yes, they do it all the time. Why? Because load over time weakens the structure. Well, what do you do with the human body? You load it, and what happens? It gets stronger. It's different math. But yet we sometimes use these Newtonian principles and we apply it to a living organism. It's wrong. Goes back to what George Bach said. You got to be careful with your model. You got to make sure the context is specific. And so history is very important. I want to know, even if you're 45 years of age and you come to me, I want to know, did you break your arm when you were 12 and you were in a cast and you were immobile? There's going to be something in your body that expresses that. Now, it could be so minute we can't even figure it out, or it can be pretty major in how your body is compensated. So history becomes one of the most important factors with respect to issues in the tissues in the current state. The next is chemical. So it's not just what we eat, but it's also what we put on our body too. These are all, because of transdermal delivery, it can be things that you put on your body that are irritants to the tissue, especially in the interstitium. So the spaces, in our textbook that look empty, but there is no empty space in the body, interestingly. Um, and there's been, we have a person who is an expert in this out where we live, and we send people for blood work all the time, and they look at all this levels of toxicity in the body and the whole chemical workup. And then the next one is hormonal, and that's not just for women, that's also for men. There is some good research coming out now on estrogen and how that affects the collagen integrity. My wife works for, a lot of, or works with a lot of women in the 45 to 65 years of age bracket. And these women will self-report. I feel like a melted candle. I feel like I'm just not stable. And there's a direct correlation with estrogen, but men have these issues too, fluctuations in testosterone. So again, that's beyond my scope, but I have to recognize it as part of the various interrelated considerations, and I can refer out. That's why, your model can only do so much. You have to look at other models. And then there's the psychological, and then there are habits. And then the last one I've come up with is mechanical, which is something that we work with. Like that's our job is the mechanical side of things, and then helping people with their habits. And then I'll have teams of people to help with the other considerations. And I always share this with people when I'm working with them on the mechanical end. So they realize that, wow, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing from a mechanical side and maybe even a habit side, but my body's not adapting in the right manner. A great example of this is I have somebody who is a famous musician, and they found out that their bone density and their spine isn't where it should be. And I said, well, from a mechanical perspective, we're going to load you to create this stimuli, get you with a nutritionist to work on the chemical, get you with a doc to work on balancing the hormonal. But if you find like you're doing the mechanical work to stimulate that adaptation and your body's just not adapting, we got to go deeper into these various interrelated considerations and try to figure this out. And so it's not just mechanical. You got to make sure that we look beyond our model.
Nice. This is awesome. This is awesome. I love it. I love it. So, guess I have one last question for you. Is like I know in grades too, like I th- maybe I'm wrong, like, but I think everything's based on like the 3D concept, like 3D
Mhm.
map or whatever. Everything's kind of based on the 3D concept. So, uh, yeah. So what's the difference from like a biomechanic standpoint and from a soft tissue standpoint when it comes like 3D?
Well, I think it goes back to the definition of soft tissue, uh, and then the reality of what we call the definition, meaning it's a multi-scale continuous body-wide network. In recent literature, and I cite all this in the classes so people can dig deep into this, Carlos Stecco and other authors who have come out and said, we've been researching the myotendinous juncture. So, how the muscles and the tendons work together. We've been studying how the muscles and the bones work to move the bones. And we haven't, up until recently, looked at how muscles radiate into connective tissue or what they're going to call fascia. So, just so I'm clear, fascia is a system. Fascia is connective tissue. Not all connective tissue is fascia. For example, blood is connective tissue. That's not fascia. But all fascia is connective tissue. I love to use the words connective tissue because they're named right, like connective. And so here's an analogy I give people. If I take my shirt, and what I do is I take my shirt and I pull it together so the shirt's loose. Then I have somebody take their two fingers, their thumb and index finger, and just grab on the middle of where my two fingers are. And I go, close your eyes and just pull my shirt towards you. You're going to feel that there's a lot of looseness. There's a lot of lag there. You follow? Now I take my shirt and I pull it apart and I put tension, pre-tension in my shirt. Now I have you do the same exercise. I go, which one's stronger? And they go, oh my God, the second one's way stronger. That is how your muscles, your anatomy is situated in your body. It actually radiates into connective tissue, and connective tissue has a pretension. So now the muscle has something to work off of. We are no longer accepting that the muscle attaches to the tendon to the bone, and that's how we move. It's way more complex than that. And now we have ways to measure this. And so they call it myofascial junction or force transmission. Now, when you look into the connective tissue, you realize it's all over the place. Now, to a physicist, these the ones I've talked to, they're like, well, this makes a lot of sense. The muscles are the contractile motors. They generate this force, and then that force gets dissipated so that the load doesn't concentrate and it allows smooth, efficient movement. Now, this is very important because what is a physical injury on the body? It's when load exceeds the tissue's capacity. You get a concentration of energy and you're not able to dissipate that. Guess what happens? It creates a disruption of unity, which is the fancy definition of what an injury is, physically speaking. And so when you start to look at the anatomy of the connective tissue and not just the linear few fibers that you might have isolated out in a textbook or in a cadaver lab, you realize that it's all dimensional or omnidirectional. And so, way back when, because Gary's been doing this a long time, he recognized, wow, instead of doing everything linear, Let's move into different dimensions. By moving into different dimensions, we start to challenge our body much more efficiently, just like we talked about earlier with systems. The system is always searching for that energy efficiency along the most efficient pathways. And so, it kind of goes back to if you wanted to make it even simpler, just the SAID principle that I think everyone learns, specific adaptation to impose demands. It's like, we move in a lot of different angles. It behooves us to challenge ourselves along these different angles to build greater capacities.
Cool. I know I already said that's the last question, but I got one more. I got one more. So, um, I guess we all know that like if I work with sprinter jumpers, there's a penultimate step, there's a takeoff step, right? Or there's a penultimate step, or and there's a jump leg. Penultimate, yeah. So, like those tissue probably like adapt differently from one leg to another. In your experience or in your standpoint, like, mm, is like is the 3D concept going to help it like from overusing I'm trying to, yeah, overusing like by like the penultimate, always doing the penultimate, always doing like, internal rotation, and the takeoff always do external rotation. Does the 3D concept kind of help the biomechanics standpoint and the soft tissue standpoint?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I probably have not a popular answer, but based on this experience, I will answer it the way I see it today. And I'm more than open, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart. I'm open to debate and I'm open to change. I love being wrong, and that way I learn so selfishly. But I will say this, I don't think we can, with intellectual honesty, determine a local capacity deficit by viewing a functional movement. So if you notice what you said in your question, you took tissue capacity as part of that question and then function. It goes back to what I said earlier. One can exhibit global function yet lack local tissue capacity. So what you can do is you videotape this person sprinting, jumping, what Gary Gray would call a transformational zone. You're taking horizontal displacement and turning it into a vertical. That's a transformation zone. In the tissue literature, they would call it an elastic recoil. You can watch these global, complex systems do that and then be a detective and go, something's not right. Now I got to break it down locally to see, is it the structural tissue capacity or is it the skill? So it's not that you don't view it. I watch people walk. But what I can't do with intellectual honesty is I can't watch a person walk and go, oh, glute medius is weak. If I say that, the bullshit meter should go off. How the heck do you know that? That doesn't follow the principles at all. You might have a clue and go, how do I test that? And what we're starting to learn about beautiful, beautiful, efficient, dynamic movement is it's not so much the muscle contraction. So I won't go too deep into this, but this one just blew my mind. About 6 months ago, somebody just sent me a lecture from a professor, and it was out of Aspetar Sports Medicine Clinic, which I believe is one of the largest in the world, where they do a ton of science. And they showed that at high intensities, the Nordic hamstring exercise is not an eccentric hamstring exercise. Most of the length changes are happening in the connective tissue. And they're finding this with running too. It's not as much eccentric, concentric in the muscle as much as it is a recoil shape change in the connective tissue. So we have to be careful in our analysis of global movement, singling out what it could be in the tissue. It can only lead us to more questions. So, with that said, my strategy is this in soft tissue management. What I do is I have, back to the question, how do you manage soft tissue? I have 5 phases, and the fifth one is function. So say running, jumping, whatever it is. So really there's four for us as practitioners, but I always show five because at the end of the day, that's what clients care about the most. They don't care about all the stuff you and I are talking about right now. They care about functioning. And so five is function. So the first one is balance, sensitivity, and fluid regulation. Why? Because sensitivity is your nervous system and fluid regulation is your circulatory system. They're two whole body systems and they run and rule everything. What a person senses is critical, regardless of how we want to frame it in our model. It's what they feel. They can use whatever words they want. It's critical. Balancing that is very important because you have a hypersensitive system or a hypo system from a sensitivity perspective, it's not as efficient, right? So healthy tissue is soft, supple, strong. When you deform it, it's not overly sensitive, and the more dense structures differentiate. Therefore, we have what's called relative movement. That's what healthy tissue is. And so the first phase is balance, sensitivity, and fluid regulation. Too much fluid isn't good, and too little isn't good. And what principle are we following? The body's mainly fluid. So balancing this becomes, and the other principle is sensory input drives motor output. So that's why phase one is the way it is. Now here's phase two. Strength coaches love this. Tissue specific force production, reduction, and transfer. That's tissue specific. Okay. So an example of this would be a soleus test for a runner. Because if the function is running, how about the foot and ankle? I would say, okay, if you're working with runners, show me your tissue specific foot and ankle evaluation. How do you measure force production, reduction, and transfer? They're different behaviors. You can produce it and not do real well with reducing it. I've seen people reduce and not produce. And then I've seen people produce and reduce and they don't transfer, which is the change of direction, that zone, if you will. Now, that's phase two. So let's just say you are good. You're producing it. This is where I think a lot of rehab in my experience, this is only experience talking, so take it for what it's worth, misses is the rate of force production, which is a different behavior. It is a different behavior. It's a different quality. So tissue specific rate of force production, reduction, and transfer is my third phase. So what would be an example? Okay, heel rise test is tissue specific force production, focusing on the foot and ankle. It's a vertical displacement. We want 1 second up, 1 second down. We use a standometer. So you know the pediatric standometers testing
Yeah.
kids' height.
Yeah.
You got a person under there. Let's see how high they can go. Now you got to replicate that 1 second up, 1 second down, use a metronome. Let's see how many you can do right versus left. Well, that's great. That's phase two. But what about phase three would be now a pogo with no knee bend? None. Your knee cannot bend because I want to emphasize the foot and ankle so there's no knee bend. Now, if I'm testing the knee, complex tissue, again, it's an emphasis. You're still working the whole body. Then I'm going to let the knee bend. It's different. So, in order to be tissue specific, you have to create constraints. Here's why. As the system's demands rise, so do the contributions. So, an easy way to explain this is if water's going down a hill, it doesn't go through the rock, it goes around the rock. So, in order for me to take the energy of that water and erode the rock, I have to do what? I have to build a dam. Then that water now gushes towards that rock, and over time, load over time will end up changing the rock. So you have to build constraints to understand tissue capacity. So the third phase, tissue specific, rate of force production, reduction, and transfer for said tissue complex. And then here's four. Phase four is position movement specific. This is where the Gray Institute, out of any organization out there, does the best work because they teach the 3D maps. We have the mentorship, which is basically a year long, where you learn all kinds of techniques. And what this is looking at all these different movement variables and learning how to be the artist with those movement variables that is specific to what the person's function is. So you can take any function, doesn't matter what it is. It can be an 80-year-old just wanting to get in and out of bed and up and down stairs, on and off a chair, and then you can position it, movement, specificity, and then you use the variables to challenge the system to make it a more robust system to do so. In other words, build its capacity. So those are my management phases, 1 through 4, ultimately leading to a better functioning capacity. Yeah.
Nice, nice. That's awesome. I love it. I love it. So I guess that's all the question I have for today. And I really feel like like even though I already done like probably most of the course online, but still feel like I learned a lot today. So for those who are interested in what we're talking about today, for those who are interested in like the 3D map or the like the calf or like the soft tissue transformation, um, where can they find you and where can they find those information?
Yeah, I have an IG page that I post. I'll probably start posting a little bit more. Soft underscore tissue underscore therapy. So soft underscore tissue underscore therapy. And there, when we have our courses, like our live courses, we'll post on there. In fact, we'll be posting in the next week or two, various dates. And then obviously the Gray Institute is grayinstitute.com. They have a lot of free education on there. In my IG page too, I always post educational tidbits. I mean, it's really not a forum to go deep into any of this stuff, but sometimes it opens up viewpoints that hopefully lead to curiosity. Um, and hopefully it's helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.